Welcome, everyone, to this very special interview hosted by the Curtin University Global Futures Initiative. My name's Adil Kader, a foreign affairs podcaster, and I will be your host today. Before we start, as the practice of the university, Curtin would like to pay respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members of our community by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which the Perth campus is located, the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation, and on our Kalgoorlie campus, the Wurundjeri people of the northeastern goldfields. As we have seen in recent times, the United Nations holds a critical spot in global affairs, and we are lucky to have the President of the body's General Assembly joining us all the way from New York, President Dennis Francis. President Francis will discuss the future of the UN, their reflections on his diplomatic career, and offer advice for students interested in diplomacy. Our questions in this interview include those submitted in by Curtin University students. President Dennis Francis was elected president of the 78th UN General Assembly in June 2023. He has had a career spanning approximately 40 years in the diplomatic service of Trinidad and Tobago. His postings include Italy, Austria, UNESCO, Canada, and the WTO. He has published books on diplomacy and is a visiting scholar at the University of the West Indies. As president of the 78th UN General Assembly, President Francis has set out four priorities for his term: peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability. President Francis, thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
President, could you please explain what the role of UN General Assembly involves and how that fits into the wider leadership of the United Nations?
The General Assembly of the United Nations comprise 193 member states. Virtually every independent state on the planet is a member of the United Nations General Assembly. The General Assembly is important because it is the only legislative body of the United Nations. It's sort of like the parliament to the world. If you can imagine a national parliament, then the General Assembly would be the international equivalent of that, with each country having one representative. That person is referred to as the permanent representative, and that person is the spokesperson or mouthpiece for his or her country. As president of the General Assembly, I am the face of the Assembly. It is my responsibility to administer the rules of procedure of the Assembly to ensure that the work of the Assembly is conducted in a professional and timely manner, and that the results that are created as a consequence of that work are taken forward.
So, speaking about your term as president, what are some of your major priorities for United Nations reform?
Well, the priorities are not the priorities of the president of the General Assembly. The priorities belong with the membership. They determine the priorities with respect to UN reform. And in that regard, there are two dynamic ongoing processes. One is the reform of the Security Council of the United Nations, for which there is an intergovernmental process, a formal negotiating process that has not yet begun, though there have been informal discussions taking place over recent years. There is benefit in having an informal process because it helps delegations to get a clearer understanding of each other's positions with respect to the proposals on the table for reform. But like I say, the formal process of negotiations have not yet begun. They will begin when members determine the time is right to begin. As of now, that discovery is in the process of unfolding. The other process that is taking place is referred to as revitalization of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And as well, there is an ad hoc working group that has been set up, it's open-ended, has been set up to take forward that process. Significant progress has been made in that context. But I would like your viewers and listeners to bear in mind that the process of reform of the United Nations is really an ongoing dynamic. For example, in the year 2000 and in 2001, I'm sorry, when the Twin Towers fell, there was no anti-terrorism capacity in the United Nations. As a consequence of that event, a whole unit was set up in the United Nations to deal with the issue of counterterrorism. And that unit continues to this day to do extremely important work to ensure that our societies are kept safe. So the process of reform has been ongoing. It's nothing new to the UN, because the UN appreciates that it needs to remain current and it needs to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world.
You mentioned earlier on in your answer about the Security Council. One of the major developments in recent times has been the General Assembly's veto initiative, which has been seen as a welcome innovation to many. Can you explain your reflections on this?
Sure. It's well known that the Security Council has not, in the recent past, been able to come to decisions, important decisions, based on its working methods, which of course is consensus. Now, the Security Council is appointed by the General Assembly. And in that sense, it represents the General Assembly. However, there have been several instances where the Council has not been successful in deciding matters relevant to international peace and security, that in the view of the General Assembly, does not adequately capture the mood and the sentiment of the Assembly. So what the Assembly did in the 76th session, I believe it was to invoke a provision that requires any member of the Security Council which has used the veto in an instance, in a matter of important international significance, must come to the Council, must come to the General Assembly in the context of an emergency special session and explain to the General Assembly why that member of the Security Council used the veto. This had never been done before. It is an accountability measure. It's a transparency measure. And the hope is that before members of the Security Council use the veto, supposedly in an arbitrary way, they will think twice and perhaps 3 times, because upon its use, they will be required to come forward and explain their actions to the General Assembly.
So you talk about the relationship between the Security Council and the General Assembly. That ties into our next question is in your opening statement, you set out 4 priorities: peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability. Let's talk about the ability to bring peace. Now, when it comes to resolutions, the Security Council is seen as more legally binding, whilst the General Assembly resolution are as not. This has led to some criticism that the GAA will not be able to maintain its relevance given the lack of binding mechanism. Given the fact that the General Assembly resolutions aren't as binding, how does the General Assembly still maintain its relevance?
Okay. Well, it is a fact that resolutions of the Security Council are legally binding. They are law. The Security Council makes law. All members of the international community, for example, sanctions. Once the Security Council determines sanctions, all members of the international community are obliged to honor and follow those edicts. In the case of the General Assembly, however, it is entirely different. The General Assembly does not make legally binding resolutions. However, what the General Assembly does is express the will, the political will or political viewpoint of the 193 members that make up the Assembly. And so it's a declaration of the views of the majority of the international community. It would be erroneous to dismiss it as inconsequential, because what it in fact does is to indicate the views of the majority of the community. And in that sense, there is a view in academia and elsewhere that the General Assembly makes soft law. It's not legally binding, but it's generally wise to follow the provisions and the declarations and the statements of the General Assembly and the resolutions, because they reflect public opinion and they reflect the opinion of the 193 official members. That's an important message.
Sure. And moving on to something that's quite important as well is we recently had the 2023 SDG Summit. Now, halfway through the deadline to the 2013 agenda, how do you feel with the progress? How do we stop the SDGs slipping out of reach?
Well, we've simply got to refocus. And that was precisely what the SDG Summit did. The Secretary General saw the need to convene heads of state and government to recommit to the Sustainable Development Goals and to Agenda 2030. And that is very much what happened. The fact of the matter is, no one foresaw the pandemic, which incidentally is still with us. It hasn't altogether disappeared. And we are living through a period of time in which the effects of the pandemic are still being broadly felt globally. No one foresaw the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and we are also living with those consequences. No one saw the supply chain disruptions, the fuel and food crises that have taken place, and no one saw rising inflation. All of these situations have come together in a sort of perfect storm to undermine progress on the SDGs. And that is what has happened. So the good news is that we are refocused, we are determined, and progress is being made on the SDGs. We are working hard to ensure that they get delivered by 2030 in accordance with a commitment given by the UN to the international community.
Now, moving on to the section of the interview where we had questions submitted in by students in regards to advice on diplomacy based on your extensive career. The first question we got in is, what advice would you give to young university students looking for a career in diplomacy and the United Nations?
First of all, you've got to study hard. You've got to try to be the best that you can be. You need to study hard. You need to read as much as you can and to try to understand what is going on in the international system, how it works, why things are the way they are. And you need to be something of a risk taker. Send an application to the UN. Send an application to a philanthropic society. Send an application to a foundation. They're always looking for bright young people because the system needs to renew itself. Don't be timid. It is not a profession for timid persons. You've got to be brave. You've got to speak up. You've got to be sensitive and to learn to listen very well to what other people are saying, because it is in that listening that you will detect the possibilities for coming to agreement. Diplomacy is not an event. That's why it takes time, because everything is checked and rechecked and recertified. Diplomacy has to function on the basis of verifiable facts. It must be fact-based. You cannot advise your government or you cannot advise the UN unless you are in possession of the facts, and as far as possible, all the facts.
I think there's some very, very insightful advice. The next question we got is, what are some of the most complex diplomatic challenges you faced in your career, and how did you approach solving them?
Well, we have one ongoing right now, and that is the situation in Gaza. Very difficult situation. It's not a new situation, but it's a highly complex situation. But we have the benefit and advantage of previous action taken by the United Nations, both by the General Assembly and by the Security Council, in the context of various resolutions. And so you would have heard reference to the two-state solution as being the only credible formula for bringing peace and security to the region insofar as the resolution of the Palestinian question is concerned. I have insisted from the very start that it was absolutely necessary for Hamas to release all of their hostages. I've insisted that humanitarian aid and support should be provided immediately to the people of Gaza so that they can have their basic needs met, those who are in need of medical care and assistance, food, water, etc. And also, I've insisted from the very start, not on a pause, I've insisted on a ceasefire. I'm happy that there is a pause, a humanitarian pause, that reunifies the families with their loved ones. I think this is extremely important. But the carnage needs to stop. And from the UN point of view, our objective is always to save lives and to protect civilians in particular. So I'm very pleased that we are making progress along the continuum of bringing this war to an end. It needs to come to an end.
Next question we got is, how do you have to navigate different cultural norms and practices when engaging in diplomatic missions abroad?
Well, you've got to study, first of all, you've got to study the culture of the people you will be meeting and or negotiating with. Because, you know, all countries have customs and practices built up over, sometimes over centuries. Business practices vary from one place to the next. So it's always a smart idea to familiarize yourself with the basic cultural norms of the society that you will be visiting, to ensure that you do not make any missteps that can cause embarrassment to your host or to yourself. Because most of these encounters that you see in the newspaper or the images you see on the evening news, These things are actually scripted ahead of time. They are managed, they are micromanaged. What you see is the end of the process. Sometimes, for example, it might take as much as a year to plan a state visit or a visit by a senior ranking official of an organization, because nothing must be left to chance. That's the nature of diplomacy. It's almost like an exact science. Everything is planned ahead of time in order to ensure that there are no surprises on either side.
Next question we have is, in your opinion, how do you see the landscape of diplomacy evolving in the future, especially considering advancements in AI?
Well, let me say this. I think AI holds out extraordinary potential to assist and support our civilization in solving some of the key problems and challenges that we face. But I am very confident that there are some things that AI simply will not be able to do. And one of those is to conduct delicate diplomatic negotiations. I don't see AI, for example, playing the role that the United States played, or that Qatar played, or that Egypt played in negotiating the temporary ceasefire and the release of the hostages. I don't see it at all. So, in fact, given the nature of things, given the nature of international relations in contemporary times and the complexities of international relations, I project that there will continue to be a growing demand for diplomats to unravel these complexities, to try to find common ground in order to resolve conflict and disputes. It's inevitable that there will be disputes because we are human beings. We don't all see the world in the same way. And therefore, there will be a need for those persons who have the technical expertise and knowledge about how to create consensus, how to create agreements that would spare the world the horror of what we have witnessed in Gaza over the last 5 or 6 weeks.
On the note of consensus, one of the other questions we got submitted in has been on a major topic you've spoken about quite a lot during your time as president, that about climate change and the impact of conflict. How far can we go on really till most major emitters do not come to a common agreement on this front? And just on that answer, you've spoken quite a bit on the impact this has on small island developing states rather. I know that's something very close to you, given your work with the Trinidad and Tobago Foreign Service. Can you explain also a bit more about this?
Yes, well, the fact is that small island developing states, by virtue of their very small size, are on the front lines of climate change. They are on the front lines of the impact of climate change because they are small, their ecosystems are very fragile, and because damage done to those systems harm the potential of those countries to develop. So that, for example, the ability of small island developing states to pursue successfully the sustainable development goals gets compromised by human-induced climate change. For example, many of the countries of the Caribbean have tourism as their main industry. Global warming and climate change has in fact already started to show signs of coral bleaching of the corals in the Caribbean Sea. When those corals die, the ability of those countries to sustain their tourism industries will be undermined. And so climate change is existential. Not only that, if you look at the picture of what is happening in the Pacific, where islands like Tuvalu are at risk of being submerged by the oceans, and therefore what you're looking at is a loss of territory, a permanent loss of territory, which might require the relocation of population, of those populations, to alternative countries or areas. So you are in fact looking at a situation that is very desperate, and that's happening now. It's not coming, it's happening now. Incrementally every year, sea level rise is rising. Sea levels are rising in the Pacific Ocean, and it is undermining the ability of those societies to function and raising questions about their statehood. Because if the land disappears, does it mean that the state disappears? What about their sovereignty? How can they exercise sovereignty without there being any territorial dimension to the state? These are matters that are not settled in international law, and we need them to be settled because we know that these questions will sooner rather than later confront many small island developing states across the globe.
President Francis, on behalf of the Curtin University Global Futures Initiative, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your deep insight provided to our students and your contributions. This discussion has been of great value to our audience.
My pleasure. And I encourage your students to become global citizens. Read as much as they can about what is going on in the world. Form an opinion. Join a club that addresses whether it's global warming or plastics in the ocean. But take action. Get up and take action. Become involved. Because the world we are trying to bring peace to and to add quality to the lives of people in belongs to your generation. You're the ones who will inherit it. So become involved now, and you will find great gratification and satisfaction in doing so.
Thank you very much, President Francis, for those inspiring words. I'm sure our audience will be inspired to take change after that.
Great.